We believe the College of Humanities has carried on Olga Wunderly's legacy of excellence in teaching and are committed to ensuring that her legacy continues here in the future by honoring her and by sharing best practices. Today you're fortunate because you get to hear one of the best teachers in the College of Humanities, Jennifer Haraguchi, talk about teaching with her lecture entitled La Vita Mista, the Dual Heritage of Schools for Girls in Early Modern Italy. We'll have an invocation first offered by Dan Paul, her colleague from the French and Italian department, and then following the invocation, her colleague Sarah Phoenix, Associate Professor of French, will offer a formal introduction. So Dan.
That doesn't look quite, there we go, okay. It is my privilege to introduce my friend and colleague, Jennifer Haraguchi, Associate Professor of Italian and this year's recipient of the Frieda Olga Wunderly Professorship. Jennifer received a bachelor's in international relations from Brigham Young University, a master's in Italian studies from the University of Virginia, and a doctorate in Italian language and literature from the University of Chicago. She was awarded a Fulbright grant during her time at Chicago, and at BYU, she has received a Women's Research Initiative grant and was named the European Studies Professor of the Year in 2015. But before collecting all of these accolades, Jennifer served as a full-time missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the Italy Catania mission. Now, unlike our Gen Z students, most of the return missionaries in the room right now are too old to have footage of them opening their mission call. Lucky for us today, there is a videographic record of the moment that would forever change the course of Jennifer's personal and professional life. So if you will indulge me, I'd like to show a 60-second clip that features Jennifer's starring turn in the 1991 church film classic, Called to Serve. You'll be able to recognize her because she's the woman in the film.
I can't open it.
Dear Elder Samowitz,
you are hereby called to serve
as a missionary of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
You are assigned to labor in the California San Jose mission,
in the Mississippi Jackson Mission,
Italy Catania mission,
Indiana Indianapolis mission, Venezuela Caracas mission.
I am happy to say that Jennifer's co-stars, her parents, are here in attendance today and that they will be signing autographs after the lecture for a nominal fee. The clip you just saw is one of our department's most treasured artifacts, not only because of its anthropological value as a catalog of 1980s hair don'ts, but also because it tells the origin story of the exceptional scholar, teacher, and colleague that Jennifer is today. When I started writing this introduction, I considered the many ways that Jennifer contributes to our department and to her field in Italian literature and culture. It struck me that some of the most meaningful work that I've seen Jennifer do happens in liminal spaces of some kind. Her role in these spaces is consistent. Like a latter-day Charon, who is the mythological ferryman of the Greek underworld, Jennifer offers steady companionship for those crossing difficult-to-navigate waters in search of higher understanding. We see this, for example, in her extensive individual consultations with 340 students who are trying to progress from literal to literary understanding in Italian. Likewise, over the past decade, Jennifer has ferried hundreds of students across the Atlantic to connect them with professional and pedagogical opportunities in the internship and study abroad program she directs. Some of the most meaningful conversations that I've ever had with Jennifer have likewise happened in liminal spaces. When I was in the purgatorial position between CFS candidate and associate professor, Jennifer spent many hours talking with me in her office doorway, urging me on with the phrase, "You're doing it, just keep doing it," suggesting that all would be well if I just stayed the course. I did, and it was, and thanks in large part to Jennifer's encouragement. The generous support she gives her students and colleagues makes her an effective teacher and collegial department citizen. She exudes good humor and bonhomie. She also easily laughs at herself, and she is the best of good sports, and it is one of her most endearing qualities. One of my fondest memories of Jennifer's good humor dates back to my first year as a faculty member at BYU. Daryl and I were chatting with Corey at the threshold of the department office suite when Jennifer entered the room with a horrified look on her face. When we asked her what was wrong, she explained that she had mistakenly assigned some of Catullus's more evocative love poems to her students for homework. I will not rehearse every detail of those verses, but suffice it to say that the mode of experiential learning advocated in these poems wasn't exactly what we would call mission-aligned. Corey, Daryl, and I did what any compassionate colleagues would do in that situation. We fell on the floor laughing and proceeded to tease her about it for the next hour. We gave her unhelpful suggestions, like just talk about nuns for the rest of the semester, that'll even things out. But then we sincerely reassured her that she had already earned her students' affection and trust, and that they would recognize the accidental assignment for what it was. An assault on the senses, to be sure, but also a very human mistake. Jennifer's expertise and ability to make things accessible have helped her cross disciplinary boundaries to bless the lives of students in a variety of programs, including in the Italian section, European Studies, and Global Women's Studies. For the past 4 years, as an Alcuin Fellow, Jennifer has co-taught a course, an honors class on virtue, maybe to make up for those Catullus poems, with her friend and fellow Chicago alum Grant Madsen, a professor here in the history department. In fact, if you were to walk across campus with Jennifer, as I have done many times, you might get the impression that the University of Chicago is little more than a farm team organization for BYU. Her network of friends and colleagues from graduate school is vast and enviable. And in true Karin fashion, she has shepherded the children of several of her Chicago friends through their studies at BYU, including recently the daughter of her friends, Jo and America Cannon. And as a quick note, Jennifer has given me permission to talk about the Cannons today. So I mention the Cannons in part because, coincidentally, Jo is actually featured on the program for today's lecture. A happy accident, as Bob Ross would say. But I also mention the Cannons because I know how much their decades-long friendship has meant to Will, Grace, Pete, Bruce, and Jennifer. In one of the most moving acts of charity and devotion I've ever seen, Jennifer traveled several times between Salt Lake and Chicago during the pandemic to provide support and strength to this family after Jo was diagnosed with a terminal illness in 2020. She was there to console and care for her friend America when Jo passed away in the summer of 2023. When I lost a beloved friend to breast cancer in September of that same year, Jennifer came to my rescue when I felt that I would drown in my sorrow. Through her friendship, she has brought me to sturdier ground and continues to steady me when tidal waves of grief threaten to flatten me completely. So by this point, I have occupied this liminal space between the prayer and the lecture for far too long, so I'll get out of the way so we can get to the good stuff. But I'll conclude by saying we should turn from the lachrymose to the joyful again. And you might suspect at this point that the portrait of Jennifer as an accomplished scholar, master teacher, and dedicated disciple has taken a turn for the hagiographic, but I assure you that all is true. Put simply, when it comes to fulfilling the imperatives of BYU's mission and dual heritage, she is doing it, and I know that she will keep doing it. So Jennifer, congratulations on this wonderful and well-earned award. We are grateful for your brilliance, your talent, your example, and your friendship, or as the Italians would more succinctly say it, bravissima.
Wow, that was really something. Oh, yeah, thanks, Sarah. I think we have the best department in the college, and Sarah's wit and good humor and collegiality have played a large part in our sense of camaraderie. I'd like to thank Dan also for the prayer. I'd like to thank the college for this award, and I'm grateful for my colleagues, family, friends, students, past teachers and mentors, and I thank Olga Wunderly Frieda Olga Wunderly for her example and enduring legacy as one of the first women teachers at BYU. So to get started, my field of study for the past decade or so has been women's education in early modern Italy. My research looks specifically at the beginnings of public education for young women in the 16th and 17th centuries. I'm interested in the transition from women's education in lay institutions, schools that were not entirely administered by the Catholic Church and that were not cloistered. I'll say more on this in a minute. The questions I've been asking in my research are: how did these schools come about? What type of educational communities did they promote? How are they different from convents? And what was the curriculum, and why were they referred to as lay schools with both the secular and religious focus? What did secular mean almost 400 years ago in Catholic Italy? As I've been researching and pondering these questions, I can't help but draw comparisons to our own academic institution and the dual emphasis we place here on secular and religious learning. My hope is that you'll find something interesting, as I have, that will help us as we navigate our attempts to blend the secular and spiritual ideals of this university. In this presentation, I would like to begin by giving some background on the history of education for women in Italy so you can better understand how this relates to the first part of my title, La Vita Mista, the mixed life, which refers to the blending of secular and religious living. Next, I will hone in on some examples of and challenges to this type of education in specific schools for girls in 17th century Italy. Then I will conclude with some connections to our own day. Let's start with the 13th and 14th centuries, when the great writers Dante, Boccaccio, and Petrarca lived. But we're not looking at Tuscany alone. My research has taken me to Rome and the surrounding countryside and Cremona in the north, about 90 kilometers east of Milan. The expectation in Italy was that young women were to reside either in the home, under the jurisdiction of a father, husband, or other male relative, or in an orphanage, or as a servant in a household, or in a convent. And this is a convent that is no longer used in Florence. Convents were also the designated place for a girl's formal education. Families often placed these girls in convents starting around the age of 6 until they were about 16 years old. These girls were called educande, or boarding students, and often referred to as being held in serbanza, in reserve, in storage, on hold, until they turned 16 years of age and were expected to become a nun or a wife, according to their family's wishes. In the convent, nuns taught girls as boarding students to read and sometimes to write, but above all, to learn the virtues, which meant good behavior and a spiritual education. In this environment, the girls were enclosed together with their nun teachers behind high walls, tiny windows with grates, if there were windows at all, and multiple locks on very few external doors. Here's another convent in Florence. And in another convent in Florence, this is called a speaking room that's attached to the convent, where family and friends could come and speak to their relatives that were there in the convent, and they would speak to them through a grate. Here's a corridor that connects a convent with a church down the street. It's kind of overgrown. This is from the 17th century. And the the bricks are kind of crumbling, but it would have allowed women to walk from the convent unseen to the church down the street, and they wouldn't be exposed to the dangers of walking in the street. And this is a wheel in a convent in Florence where I actually spoke to a nun, a cloistered nun, through the little holes in the middle. She wasn't able to be seen, and then she turned the wheel and to give me a piece of paper with an email address of an archivist, so she could stay completely cloistered. And this is at that convent in Florence. To cloister women in the early modern period meant to keep them chaste, safe from the evil designs of men, but also from the standpoint of spiritual progression. It was believed that the contemplative life, interpreted as being completely cut off from the world, was actually superior to the active life, being in the world. To enter the convent as a boarding student, a girl's relatives had to pay a fee, which was referred to as a dowry. And by the 15th and 16th centuries, dowries were, whether to enter a convent or a marriage contract, had become ever more exorbitant and almost impossible to pay unless families were very wealthy. Families with limited funds often couldn't even afford to feed and keep daughters in their homes. By the 15th and 16th centuries, communities began to establish lay institutions, which were not cloistered, where poor girls, orphans, reformed prostitutes, widows, and battered wives could find refuge and learn how to sew in order to survive financially and even earn money for their families or for a dowry. The church and society believed that these lay institutions would help keep women safe off the streets or out of the fields working, and thus avoiding compromising situations with men. Another thing that was happening at this time in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, in 1563, at the 25th session of the Council of Trent, Catholic leadership emphasized the importance of educating young people, declaring that it was of the utmost importance to reinforce correct doctrine in order to pull the youth away from the Protestant movement and back to the Catholic faith, and to teach them good Christian behavior for a decent moral society. This is one of the books that came out of that period, Antoniano's 1584 on the Christian education of children. For centuries, boys and young men were educated in monasteries or confraternities without the burden of dowry inflation, so they could easily continue their education in these places with the new emphasis that was required by the Catholic Church. But for women, it was a bit more complicated to figure out how to formally educate them. The numerous charitable institutions that had been created for women focused primarily on teaching them a trade, how to sew, how to knit, and do embroidery, and not so much how to read and write. And it would have been shocking anyway to put upper-class women in these places for an education. More importantly, a formal institutionalized education for girls up to this point had only taken place in enclosed convents that were shut off from the world. Because the cost of entering the convent as a boarding student was becoming increasingly too expensive, and since the church wanted women of all classes to be educated, some bishops and cardinals began promoting the establishment of lay institutions, not to teach women a trade, but with the primary purpose of education. These institutions, as the first public schools for girls, depended on both church and government assistance, and were directed by lay women who were also their teachers, as opposed to nuns. Here's a list of some of the 17th century schools I've been studying, where they are located, and the names of their founders, who were lay women. I hope to be able to publish a study of these schools because not much, if anything, has been written on them in a scholarly or comparative way. On the one hand, these first public schools for girls were supported by some of the clergy because they were fulfilling the Tridentine charge to educate the youth. But on the other hand, many people, and some clergy too, were not used to seeing women in charge as teachers and administrators, women living together without male supervision. And again, everyone knew that proper spiritual education for women was traditionally understood only to take place in a cloistered setting. In the archival sources, I've found some reactions to these new schools. In one of the schools, the teachers were yelled at by a man on the street. It was reported that he screamed at them, "All hell will break loose if you bring one of these schools to our community." Someone also shot a musket through a window in the teacher's lodging. It didn't harm them, but it damaged some furniture. And in another school, the schoolgirls were mistaken for girls of another lay institution near theirs, which had been condemned, and the leadership excommunicated because the clergy and women there had illicit relationships. And in another school, there were complaints and open rebellion among the women themselves when one priest tried to create a single institution to house both lay women and nuns together. The nuns did not like that. In my research in Cremona, where I was trying to find out more information about the Collegio della Beata Vergine, founded in 1610, I came across a fascinating book in the form of a dialogue between a teacher and a schoolgirl, where the teacher tries to justify the reasons why a young lady would choose to go to a lay school instead of the convent for her education. In the dialogue, the schoolgirl has a number of questions which the teacher responds to. The schoolgirl voices the complaint that she has heard from family members and friends that the Collegio is too new and that they should just stick to what they know, the tradition of educating girls in the convent. The teacher responds that this reasoning isn't logical, that even Christ instituted something that was new. She then tells the schoolgirl to respond to others by saying that one could also say that new wine isn't good, new fruit isn't good, a new piece of clothing isn't good. Another complaint the schoolgirl says she gets is that others think she should be cloistered, shut off from the outside world, that she should not be venturing outside of the school. Her teacher confirms that there are in fact many who believe in a respected French theologian who writes that those who wander rarely become saints. But her counter-response to this is that there have actually been female saints, Lucy, Agatha, Cecilia, Catherine, and many others who were not enclosed, and that Jesus Christ himself sent various holy men to preach and help others in the world. The teacher insists that they can also imitate this way of life, and that if they are not enclosed, they can better serve the greatest number of girls in a very critical moment of their lives. The teacher then begins to discuss their school life in terms of la vita mista, or the mixed life. And she goes on to explain how it represents a combination of the active and the contemplative lives. They are active in helping themselves and others in their spiritual and moral education, which includes the contemplative life of prayer, reading, meditation, and contemplation, which will guide them on the path of Christian perfection. At the time, this way of life, attempting to mix the active and the contemplative, was difficult for society to accept. In fact, the schoolgirl says that her family and friends tell her that she can't possibly tenere il piede in due scarpe. She can't keep one foot in two shoes. And that she must, as the proverb says, be o carne, o pesce, o religiosa, o secolare. That you have to be either meat or fish or religious or secular. That she can't have it both ways. She can't play both sides. So up to this point in my talk, I've pointed to the physical notion of being cloistered or not cloistered. Now I'd like to move to a centuries-old conceptual struggle regarding the mixed life. The history of this idea was something that societies have faced since the beginning of Western civilization, when ancient Greek philosophers discussed the attempts to balance the bios praktikos, the life of the citizen with its political duties, and the bios theoretikos, the life of the philosopher in the speculative pursuit of truth, a notion which Christians then took over as the theoria contemplatio to describe the vision of God promised in Scripture. Early Christians actually believed that both types of life were necessary, but that there were many ways of understanding what that meant and which life was meant for whom. Preference was given to the contemplative life as superior to the active life, since it was the most perfect of the two. You can think of the New Testament story of Mary and Martha and how Mary chose the better part. The prevailing view was that the contemplative life was in the cloister. And this was proposed by St. Benedict, who established a rule which all monasteries adopted, where monks were most concerned about an individual's desire for a vision of God rather than about one's own obligation towards his fellow man. The community in the monastery was seen as a setting for individual growth and not as an opportunity for service. The active life, on the other hand, was a calling to serve one's neighbor in love through teaching, taking care of the needy in the world, and in missionary work. But other monasteries stayed closer to the view of St. Augustine, who understood a necessary oscillation between the active and the contemplative lives. Augustine's followers believed in the responsibility that members of a community had for each other. They had a duty to inspire one another to spiritual growth. In addition to the Word of God, virtuous behavior for them was a great teaching tool. These competing ideas were at the heart of the struggle in creating these new schools for girls at the time of the Counter-Reformation. In this era, there were some very dynamic priests who spoke up about things the Catholic Church hadn't considered for a while. One of them, Ignatius of Loyola, spoke of being active while in contemplation. And the Dominican friar, Battista da Crema, revitalized the idea of the beauty of a mixed life, or a third life, as he called it. He says the third life, which is more difficult and rare, consists of great perfection, which occurs when these lives, that is, active and contemplative, may be present in the same person. Such persons were Christ and the apostles, and some other saints who were trained in both, as action does not impede contemplation, nor contemplation weakens action. Battista da Crema wrote that the active and contemplative must be lived simultaneously. He says, mixed life is still imperfect when, that is, it is engaged at one time with the active and at another with the contemplative. The one that is good and perfect is the one that embraces both at the same time in its perfection. Administrators and teachers of these first public schools for girls were influenced by these teachings of Reformed theology to seek both an affirmation and a rejection of the world. The instructions for teaching Christian doctrine at one of the schools I studied in Montefiascone say the following. The life of the maestre, or teachers, must be a kind of existence in which, without being confined to cloisters or fully engaged in worldly matters, they enjoy the privileges of both these states without suffering their disadvantages. Those who are confined in monasteries find greater security for their spiritual growth and have fewer occasions to sin, but they are deprived of the merit of working directly for the salvation of others. Those who remain in the world have more opportunities to practice works of mercy, but are more exposed to dangers regarding their own salvation. To find a way to live in the world without experiencing its dangers and to remain withdrawn without losing the merit of helping others through both instruction and example is a third way of life that the maestre must lead, combining the duties of religious life with the challenges of secular life. What I've understood from the sources is that these schools for girls were attempting to find some kind of balance in spirituality and living in the world. They knew it was best not to block out the world or live in isolation, but to engage with the world in all its messiness, even right within their own communities. The sources speak of these schools as being secular, but we're not to interpret secular by our terminology today. What the sources mean is that they were not cloistered. They weren't entirely religious in nature and essentially were not held to monastic rules and thus were more able to accept worldly or temporal ways. They had the backing of clergy and society for the most part, who were forced into a situation where the church was demanding something, education for all youth, that only could be fulfilled when society stepped in. This is a moment of monumental change in the Catholic Church, as many were breaking away and leadership was doubling down on doctrine, but also had to make concessions. Some of the leaders were open to this change, others were not. What characterized the post-Tridentine era was an effort to express new spiritual concerns and goals with new rules, institutions, and styles of life. What the teacher of this dialogue and other women administrators at the first public schools for girls in Italy were facing in this era was a new way of learning which encompassed paradox, ambivalence, and tension in a changing society. The teacher in the dialogue also refers to education for girls at the collegio in terms of a scala perfectionis, or a ladder of perfection, which in certain movements of Catholic reform of this time was a way of approaching God by degrees or stages, and which was rooted in free will, since it was important that individuals accept of their own choice the salvation of Christ. Since the teachers of these public schools were lay women, they did not take solemn vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience that the nuns were required to take, and which were extremely hard to be released from. Rather, the lay women of these schools took simple vows. They were actually the same ones of chastity, poverty, and obedience, but they accepted them voluntarily in their hearts. And these vows could be broken if needed. For example, if a woman were to marry or she needed to leave the institution for any reason, she was not held to these vows. In this way, the girls who were educated in these institutions were made explicitly aware of the concept of free will, the agency to choose one's own inner conversion, the idea that salvation and spiritual progress were tied not just to external acts, but to the intention underlying these acts. A founder of two of these schools for girls in Florence, Eleonora Ramirez di Montalvo, came to realize the importance of agency. At the age of 18, her mother removed her forcibly from the convent to enter an arranged marriage. Montalvo had actually wanted to stay in the convent after her education was complete there. She wanted to become a nun. And now that she was a married woman, she had no chance of becoming an abbess of a convent and educating young women, which was her greatest desire. However, since lay schools were now possible, and because she had the backing of the Grand Duchess of Florence, she was able to establish the first lay schools for girls in Florence in the early 1600s. With the forced marriage experience she had just come from, she now wanted to make sure that free choice was an integral part of the curriculum in her schools. In her instructions to teachers, she says, "Let the girls decide, let them choose their path at age 15, whether they marry, become a nun, or stay in this congregation as a teacher." And staying in the congregation meant that they would have the opportunity of becoming professional teachers, some of the very first in early modern Italy. Additionally, for Montalvo, it was important that the teachers of her new schools practice encouragement and persuasion, which she believed were at the heart of teaching and learning, as opposed to the strict obedience of a convent education. In her instructions for teachers, she says, encourage them to demonstrate humility, patience, and meekness, not with too much force or severity, but by example and effective persuasion, so that they get accustomed to performing acts of virtue spontaneously. And it will be good to give them rewards when they behave honorably. In reproving and correcting them, do not use words or methods that are disparaging. Treat them in appropriate ways for their level, with discretion and prudence. They will respect you more seeing that you are wise and virtuous than they would perceiving you as strict and severe. To encourage and persuade the women in her educational communities, Montalvo found theatrical performance to be especially effective. One play in particular that she wrote, the play of the Virtues and Vices, demonstrated freedom of choice and the consequences of one's actions in a lighthearted and playful way. Montalvo wasn't doing anything new by including the performance of plays in her schools. Sacred plays had been performed in convents for centuries. But in this time period, ecclesiastical leaders were voicing their disapproval. They were suspicious of plays and wanted to enforce oversight. Administrative overreach was strong. For example, in 1610, the Archbishop of Florence made a declaration that play performances required special approval. So, at the founding of her schools, Montalvo wasn't ready initially to have her girls perform plays. Her first constitutions state that plays are not allowed because she thought they were too distracting and took girls away from their devotions. However, 5 years later, Montalvo changed her mind and began to write plays to persuade her girls to practice good moral behavior, to instruct and entertain them. The plays Montalvo wrote followed the traditional model of plays we know that were performed in convents. They were in poetry, and on the right-hand side you can see in the prologue they were in octaves, and they featured allegorical characters and saints. But in this particular play, the play of the Virtues and Vices, Montalvo adopted a secular technique, which she thought would best promote her pedagogy. Her aim was to mix the scenes of allegorical virtues and vices in poetry with the scenes of simulated conversations of her students and teachers in prose. In this way, she wanted to model good and bad behavior through credible conversations, and then leave the choice up to the girls, hopefully teaching them to want to be good after witnessing or performing in a performance. The scenes in prose, simulating actual conversations full of jargon and idioms, they were super hard to translate, with actors who played themselves, would have been quite striking for both actors and audience, since they would have been more accustomed to plays that featured allegorical characters more removed from them who spoke in lofty and polished poetry. I believe Montalvo was doing what we would call today performance ethnography or ethnodrama. Ethnodrama is typically carried out by interviewing certain subjects and then performing these interviews on stage through character actors. According to one of its primary theorists, ethnodrama is based on the principle that when audiences see actual conversations play out before their eyes, they are able to remove themselves from the action and simultaneously see themselves in the action. The theorist Dwight Conquergood says that the various genres of cultural performance collectively produce in ethnodrama a set of meta-languages whereby a group or community not merely expresses itself, but more actively tries to understand itself in order to change itself. So I'd like to show you a clip of a performance of two scenes in prose from the Rappresentazione delle Virtù e dei Vizi. And here is our cast of characters, and I think they're present today. Yes, they are, awesome. So we have the teacher represented by Loredana Lobianco, maybe many of you know her, and the young woman Sofia Cuscetto, and the schoolgirls Giorgia Cobelli, and my own son was the videographer. These actors here represent two hermitages, a good one and a bad one. And hermitages were Montalvo's unique way of grouping students, both physically and conceptually, within her schools. They were micro-communities, small instructional groups with a teacher, a young woman, and one or more little girls. Montalvo believed that the girls of her schools had better educational experiences when they were part of a familial environment that included women of varying ages. And I haven't seen this strategy in any of the other schools that I study. In the first scene that you're going to see of the Good Hermitage, you'll see a teacher, a young woman, and a schoolgirl who are positive, loving, and helpful, who serve each other willingly. They're happy with their surroundings, their superiors, their confessor. I'll actually just show you 1 minute of this because the Bad Hermitage is a lot more entertaining. So that in the scene of the Bad Hermitage, you'll see our same actors. They would have actually been different ones, but we're using our same actors, who criticize and find fault with everyone and everything. Like hallway cynics, they complain, are judgmental and suspicious and full of resentment. And the conversations that the Good and Bad Hermitages have in these two scenes are parallel. The subject matter is identical. It's just that one group portrays everything in a good light and the other one is completely negative. I think that the performers in Montalvo schools would have had a lot of fun with this, perhaps even improvising some of the conversations themselves. As you watch, think about the girls of Montalvo schools and the concept of ethnodrama. What I find fascinating about Montalvo's technique to include conversations she might have actually heard is that I think she was keyed into the benefits of ethnodrama even before ethnodrama was a thing. The play of the virtues and vices demonstrates the principle that when audiences are immersed in a particular experience, that they may perhaps become more receptive to the material and are more likely to adjust their perceptions and beliefs. Montalvo's play would have challenged their assumptions as they would have heard things in a new way and hopefully with more understanding. Okay, let's progress here. Here's the Good Hermitage, and right after you'll see the Bad Hermitage.
Gloria alla Santissima Trinità, sorelle mie.
In secula seculorum. Amen.
Fermiamoci qui un po' insieme, sorelle mie care, per aspettare se passasse alcuna delle nostre superiori, perché io le voglio domandare una grazia.
Mi fermerò volentieri perché io mi sento un poco di male.
Questo mi dispiace, ma perché, sorella cara, vi siete levata di buona ora e scesa in basso?
Io mi sforzo quanto posso, per amor di Dio, massime per essere all'orazione e delle altre cose comune.
Voi fate benissimo, Dio vi conservi, accresca in questo buon animo, ma con tutto ciò bisogna avere una discrezione ed avere sicura nel principio per guarire presto e tornare a servire Dio.
Così ho pensato di fare. Andrò adesso in sul letto sin tanto che sono all'orazione, poi mi leverò.
Benissimo. Fatto se voi sarete migliorata, ma caso che mandasse innanzi, dovete spogliarvi, entrare a letto e pigliare tutte le vostre comodità.
Andate, sorella mia, non vi risparmiate in cosa nessuna. Chiamatemi di giorno e di notte, che io vi servirò con tutto l'affetto.
Vi ringrazio, e già ho visto l'esperienza della vostra carità.
Così è l'obbligo mio. Oimè, sorelle mie, fermiamoci un poco qui.
Che volete fare qui adesso? Che passino i superiori e ci facciano qualche cappello?
Non sarebbe la prima volta.
E io l'ho caro che le passo perché le può parlare.
E che gli volete voi dire?
Ho sentito dire che le vogliono fare non so che riforma e non so che tresche. E voglio chiedere che noi pensassimo che io voglio andare in solitudine o stare assistente e che io non può fare altro.
Io non posso fare queste cose.
Né io. Faccio in conto che io non ci sia, tanto più che io mi sento male.
E che male avete voi? Mi pare che abbiate una buona cera.
E state a sentire noi stesse a parlare ammalata perché io non posso fare niente.
Come mi parlate? Si può fare poco capitale ed è fatti vostri.
Anch'io non vi posso fare servizio a nessuno.
Già lo so per esperienza come voi fate, ma non dubitate che se avrò bisogno farò capitale dell'infermiera.
Andate a chiamarla avanti che mi venga male, perché io non posso andare a girare per tutta la casa.
E io ho pensato una cosa e ve la dico a tutte e due voi. Se vi venisse qualche notte, chiamate queste nostre vicine, che ci sono tanto molte proferte perché io non mi posso muovere.
Ne fanno di molte parole, ma io non li credo.
Le vedranno tutti i fatti nostri e ci appelleranno in qualche cosa.
Che ci potranno inappellare, se non per malignità?
Anzi, le verranno volentieri a dir perché non le conoscete, le sono ambiziose e hanno caro di parere virtuose e caritative.
Sì, le non me ne vendono.
Ed io non li credo.
Quanti a me dalla prima all'ultima ce n'è una che non mi piaccia.
Da poco a grado anch'io so a dire il vero.
E mi fanno sempre qualche cortesia.
Non c'è nessuna che ci voglia bene.
Neanche le superiore, sebbene le ci fanno delle offerte e delle parole.
Le non vogliono bene a me e io non voglio bene a loro. Andiamo d'accordo in questo.
In quanto alle superiori, le che siano zelante, ma non è vero. Le fanno il loro interesse e non hanno nessuna carità.
Basta loro di dar grandi penitenze.
E a me sempre me la danno torto, questo è pur vero.
E io lo fo per non poter far altro.
E così fo io.
Anche il confessore per dirvela tiene dalla loro. Io ho provato a dirgli qualche volta del malgoverno di casa e subito mi ha serrato la bocca, con dirmi che io vado a farmi i fatti miei e basta, e non vi dico più altro.
A me non mi basta dire parola di queste cose, subito mi affretta e sempre mi fa un sermone.
Mi dice una messa tanto lunga che mi viene fastidio.
Se vuoi dire il vero, mi viene a noia ogni cosa.
Non vi direi mai la malinconia che io sento. Quando vado per casa non ci trovo nulla secondo il mio genio. C'è un freddo in queste terrazze che spezza la testa.
E quel corridore lungo lungo che non finisce mai.
Mi piacerebbe ogni cosa se si ci potesse cicalare, ma si può parlare in quel giardino ma non mi fa pro.
E perché non vi fa pro? Forse vi borbottano?
E ci fanno tante difficoltà che non si può con nulla.
Sì, vi intendo voi, vorreste strappare ogni cosa.
E non è tanto cotesto, è che se io rido, salto, fa qualche gioco in più, delle altre subito mi riprendono e dicono che io paio una vergine stolta.
Questo lo dicono anche a me, a quante volte mi è stata data questa similitudine.
A me lei mi portano qualche rispetto e non mi direbbero apertamente queste cose, ma tutti di non mancano bottoni. Al capitolo tutti i lamenti che fa la priora la dice per me. Quando fa quel sermone del dare male esempio, del parlare forte, della poca umiltà, tutto è diretto a me.
Intendo anch'io che tutto è detto per il nostro eremo, ma le lascio dire.
Non le cerebbero a lasciare stare, ci siete voi per maestra, ci basta questo.
Certo, lo avrebbero a fare che dirla fra noi, non so più di loro.
Oh, pensate voi se la credano questa cosa. E per dirvela, non c'è nessuno in casa che vi possa patire.
E quasi sempre le dicono mal di voi.
Perché le sono pieni di malizia e mi appongono ogni cosa. E voi avreste risentire di rabbia quando dicono male di noi.
Le non me le dicono sul viso, ma io ne intendo e conosco i loro modi e quel che vogliono inferire.
Anche a me non me la dicono affatto, ma lo so perché sto sentire quando passo dalle porte. E quando sento parlare di maleficazione penso che le dichino sempre per noi.
Non ne dubitate di questo e di grazia, state ben attenti quando andate per casa. E se voi sentite qualche cosa o far qualcosa cenno, massimo alle superiori, che voi pensasse che fosse contro di me, ditemelo subito che io voglio far gran risentimento.
Dai, partiamoci di qui, che qualcuno ci sarà a sentire e gli diranno ogni cosa.
E ci appiccheranno un brandello.
Voi vorreste subito intraverci in quell'eremo ed io ci sto mai volentieri, quando si possa dir mai.
Io vado a far certe mie faccende, quando sono all'orazione me ne andrò a letto.
Io starò da voi a lotta, perché non è dovere che voi siate sola.
Quanto all'orazione la faranno da loro stasera, perché io non voglio più scendere a questo freddo, intanto leviamoci di qui e andiamo a fare i fatti nostri.
Pure vi risolvessi una volta.
E ne sarà il tempo.
We had to do multiple takes, and I could even hear Georgia back there giggling still because she couldn't stop laughing. It was really fun. It was fun to do that with them. And I think the girls of Montalvo schools would have found this to be entertaining, and especially the ending, because some of the girls would have dressed up as devils and dragged the bad hermitage in chains down to hell. That's the ending of the play. So what lessons can we learn from this past about teaching and learning here at our own dual heritage institution? In our own moment, where we're witnessing certain crises of faith and concerns about institutional overreach, I think we would do well to remember the following principles of Montalvo schools. Free agency, persuasion, encouragement, and compassion and empathy for others as we seek to blend spiritual and secular learning. In my teaching and advising at our own dual heritage institution, I believe these three principles are the most important aspects of the gospel of Jesus Christ and should be at the heart of everything we do. What I've learned as a teacher at BYU is that I have to let go of my desire to control the outcome, which often flies in the face of assessment measures. True learning and growth, whether spiritual or secular for students, happens on their own terms. I can only offer material or experiences and encourage students to apply themselves and integrate my teachings into their lives, but it's up to them to choose what to make of it, to figure out how to blend both spiritual and secular learning. There's a scripture in Doctrine and Covenants 121 that keeps coming to my mind. No power or influence can or ought to be maintained only by persuasion, by long-suffering, by gentleness and meekness, and by love unfeigned, by kindness and pure knowledge, which shall greatly enlarge the soul without hypocrisy and without guile. In my 12 years at BYU, I've found that students learn so much more when they are in charge of their own learning. What they study and truly remember the most are the presentations they create or the research and writing they do on topics of their choosing, or their intense preparation when they have to come face-to-face with me in an oral interview or a paper consultation. And I have some of my students here. We're going to do that next week. And I have to remember that my success doesn't always look like what success is for them. Maybe on an internship program, what they need to learn most doesn't come from any assignment that I or Andrew Roberts gives them, nor does it only come from writing a report for a company where they're interning or meeting their required 42 hours of work per credit hour. What I've seen that has been the greatest learning opportunity for students is when they finally figure out how to get along with others in a living situation, or they see the value of staying with a host family that does things differently, or they learn how to successfully navigate the metro and bus system in Rome, or they try to advocate for more working hours with an indifferent supervisor, or when they learn ways to talk with their supervisor and coworkers about how and why it matters that their religious life intersects with their studies and work, why they choose to blend their secular and religious lives. I'm always thrilled when my Rome interns report to me that their supervisors are fascinated by what they're experiencing outside of work. They're excited about their interest in Italian culture and Catholicism. Maybe it's the magic of Rome, but I find that this environment helps my interns easily identify and appreciate how to blend the secular with the spiritual. Being in Rome with BYU students helps me feel a certain kinship to the 17th century laywomen I study who worked to integrate the active and contemplative lives, the spiritual and the secular, in their schools. We at BYU, I think, are part of a similar process. At times it may feel constraining or even implausible, but the underlying principles of our dual heritage institution ultimately enable and facilitate beautiful associations and enduring rewards. Thanks.